What is a historical film? Is such a thing a contradiction in terms? Is the idea of history on film, indicative of something sinister? And is that something else signifying the end of history itself? Hello and welcome everyone. I've been thinking about doing a companion piece to all of my film reviews on this channel as someone who both reviews films from a historical standpoint and indeed studies conceptual history, but this is not actually the impetus for this evening's stream. I was rereading Baudrillard for other various reasons, and it really struck me reading some particular segments how he was looking at film and its involvement in history and his particular conception of history, which is, again, very dissimilar from what I'm used to, what I typically engage with. And indeed, I often come back when discussing the notion of history on film to historical reenactment. A historian that I often refer to as someone called R.G. Collingwood. He's a formative influence on mine. I wouldn't say, as of now, he's one of my great influences, but nevertheless, he's a great historian to get your interest in historical theory really moving. He also presents a interesting history of the writing of history, historiography itself. So I was looking at Baudrillard and thinking, okay, well, how do these two thinkers intersect and how does this relate to the notion of film? Because really, looking at it superficially, if we're going to look at history as a form of tourism into the past, why can't film be a historical artifact? Why can't it be a testament to history? So, for example, the thumbnail here is Apocalypse Now, something I'll be referring to later. It comes down to a very basic Rankian notion that anyone who's familiar with historical theory will be familiar with. To represent the past as it actually was. Indeed, if you read a lot of 19th century thinkers, positivists in particular, a posteriori positivists believe essentially that you could almost imbibe history passively. It's about receiving the information, it's about receiving the facts. So much of history going forward has completely rejected this premise, but if that were true, if you can receive history passively, then film basically as a representation of historical events placed in some sort of narrative or chronology can actually be indicative of this, again, attempt to represent history as a literal reenactment. Bondarchuk's Battle of Waterloo is a superlative example of this. But this is only a superficial aspect of what I'm really interested in, which is history and its relationship with what Baudrillard is focused on in particular, Jean Baudrillard, the French postmodernist sociologist, which is the hyperreal, the notion that there is a post-objective truth. There lies a distinction between objectivity and a simulated reality. Indeed, there is an argument to be made, and I'll interrogate it somewhat this evening. To what extent are all histories that people commonly sort of perceive history as simulated realities? Do these not really exist? And what does Baudrillard really mean when he plays with this notion that cinema is in fact the end of history? A lot of people read Baudrillard, and I think, frankly, it breaks their minds. A lot of Baudrillardian uh, analysis tends to revolve around the notion of dissecting politics in particular. In fact, I've been frankly inundated with political fabrications on a theme of Baudrillard regarding to the clown show and all politics is fake that frankly I'm finding it less and less interesting. But this is an angle from which to finally talk about Baudrillard, a subject I've been putting off for a while, and engage him in a way in which I don't necessarily think people who have even read Baudrillard would necessarily encounter him. Part of his conception of history itself is removed from how he views history in the academy, academic history, which is history of events as opposed to a post-World War II, quote-unquote, history, where we have instead of real events, we have simulated events. We have history which is relayed to the populace through mass media. We have history which is very effectively curated, often politically, invariably politically. Indeed, part of the whole emphasis on hyperreality is about deconstructing themes, pieces of media, politics, factions, representations, all through the vein that all of this is to somehow fake or it exists to reinforce a system of power. That is really what post-structuralism, which is the school which Baudrillard to some extent can be seen to be identifying with, represents. So if we look at history from that point of view, we're not looking at academic history, we're talking about real histories and people engaging in events that matter, ostensibly, like the First World War, like the Russian Revolution, like the Second World War, like landing on the beaches in D-Day and flying the hammer and sickle flag above the Reichstag. We take these moments and instead we have simulations of that, we have documentaries of that, we have films and images of that, and that is how not only people are invited into understanding the past, who no longer actively participated in this great momentous cycle of the history of events, but is also how historians deal with it as well. In other words, this is an aspect which affects everyone. And trying to look at the distinction between the passive imbiber of historical film and the historian is another major theme of tonight's discussion. You can trace the roots of this notion of hyperreality, the essence of a thing being in the semblance of the thing, rather than referring to any greater truth, in the idea of God and iconoclasm. We see this in the Bible with the Golden Bull. You see it with the Second Temple in Jerusalem. You see it with Catholicism. I will make the contention that Napoleon's First French Empire is almost entirely a creation of hyperreal postmodernism. And that's why I always go back to this notion that Napoleon, for example, was usurpation infected every single aspect of his political program, which necessitated this reference to the hyperreal. When more sort of mainstream commentators focus on the hyperreal, they will tend to refer to, say, for example, Adam Curtis and his engagement with Putinism in Russia, which simultaneously deals with many aspects of the end of history. In the case of Putin, trying to relive the moment of World War II and Victory Day over and over and over again in various forms, and tweaking the political circumstances in order to present basically an image of politics today. And of course, by extension, every faction who was involved in World War I is also guilty of that in various ways. So for Baudrillard, the end of history is the end of events. Baudrillard, in many ways, is representing the end of history, but is also a remarkable inversion of how most people are familiar with that term, which is through the political scientist Francis Fukuyama. When Francis Fukuyama wrote his End of History, Baudrillard's response was basically to say, okay, well, if this is the end of history, then you are presenting the illusion of the end. In other words, the very notion of the end of history itself is nothing but a simulation. And if anything, again, that's to indicate that not only does history no longer exist, but the end of history no longer exists. The more you sort of look into a rabbit hole, you'll be just stuck into a conceptual quagmire. And Baudrillard doesn't try and liberate his reader from that circumstance. If anything, he indulges in it and trolls his audience. So, for example, at the beginning of his most famous book, Simulacra and Simulation, he starts off with a quotation: "The simulacrum is never what hides the truth. It is truth that hides the fact that there is none. The simulacrum is true, Ecclesiastes." That is false on two levels. The first is the notion that the simulacrum is true. That is basically a logical statement which follows from the fact that if, again, there is truth essentially which hides the fact that there is no truth, then what is truth within that situation? Almost making the statement a nonsense. But also the notion that this is actually a scriptural quote as well. Complete nonsense. And I think, again, as Baudrillard is responding to the Academy, he's essentially testing the intellectual resolve of his audience in terms of being able to either passively receive information like that, which is so blatantly false and you can say intentionally absurd, and whether he's actually just trying to allow for the reader to enter into his mindset about everything being a form of semblances and simulacra. So take Fukuyama and the end of history. If you were to read, say, for example, Giambattista Vico's New Science, Giambattista Vico, one of the most significant thinkers and thinkers in the discipline of history, at times within the New Science, he advocates for a radical form of historicism, one which is too radical, it must be said, for me. But nevertheless, if you're going to read Vico into someone like Francis Fukuyama, you should not look at Fukuyama as a thinker. You should look at him instead as a simple expression, a cultural expression of the unipolar moment following the end of the Cold War. And for Vico, this would be downstream of American culture. In other words, an expression of American cultural supremacy, to have this thinker pop this idea out that liberal democracy has triumphed. And now it's simply a matter of the continuing triumph of liberal democracy throughout the entire world, getting rid of Islamic terror states and Gulf principalities and Asiatic sort of pseudo-communism and all that, instead replacing it with the triumph of sort of Chicago school-based economics and the idea that political participation can be sublimated to economic activity. That is the Fukuyama delusion, which Baudrillard accepts as the delusion. But for Baudrillard, he takes this theme really from Vico, which is no longer that it's an expression of culture. Rather, that culture is fabricated. And the intention behind someone like Francis Fukuyama is that it's an extension of security interests of America. It is a justification for continued imperialism in the US for the US government. And what could be a better expression for that than the fact that, again, ostensibly, what is the Gulf War? The Gulf War is, again, one of these triumphs of the unipolar moment, and by extension, therefore, it almost has to be fake. This is why I play into this notion that Baudrillard represents a radically different conception of history from which, again, I'm used to expressing on this channel, because I've often, especially in indulging in counterfactuals, it's not something I can get away with when talking about real history, is supposition. History as ought to have happened based on a number of logical propositions. Well, by that same token, you could almost say that Baudrillard is taking these ideas of logical suppositions from the point of view of the interests of power, security, and propaganda, and he's placing it on historical events to actually present, again, the real as simulacra in this case, and some rather sort of remarkable circumstances. So, having underscored the basis of hyperreality and how this can bleed into our conception of film, I just want to underline Baudrillard's conception of representation versus simulation by reading a short segment from Simulacra. Representation stems from the principle of the equivalence of the sign and of the real. Even if the equivalence is utopian, it is a fundamental axiom. Simulation, on the contrary, stems from the utopia of the principle of equivalence, from the radical negation of the sign of value, from the sign of the reversion and death sentence of every reference, whereas representation attempts to absorb simulation by interpreting it as false representation. Simulation envelops the whole edifice of representation itself as a simulacrum. For Baudrillard, the notion of utopia is taken literally to mean no place. That's where we really get the expression when Thomas More essentially wrote it, and his utopia as a joke in terms of trying to find an ideal sort of form of political settlement. Of course, being a Catholic, it really sort of comes across as especially sort of post-Augustinianism, it comes across as a rather contradiction in terms. But history, the writing of history, is all about representation and analogy. And so this idea essentially that all of these representations are, again, in fact, interpreting nothing, rather they are all part of an edifice of a simulacrum, would effectively break the basis of history, because history, in terms of its identification, its purpose, it is truth. And it is fundamentally, again, a truth trying to understand and distill human action. So if everything, again, is related to this idea of simulacrum, then the stories that we tell ourselves, the attempts at representation and analogy, they all feed into certain conceits which demonstrably, again, perpetuate systems of culture, or more cynically, systems of power. And that's how Baudrillard would see it. He then goes on to say that such would be a successive phases of the image. When he talks about the image, he's not really using it in the sense that we would understand it colloquially. He's using it in this image, the sense of it being the icon, the religious image. And therefore, the image in itself is representative of an entire reality. The image is a reflection of a profound reality, point one. The image masks and denatures a profound reality. Point three, the image masks the absence of a profound reality. And four, the image has no relation to any reality whatsoever. It is only a pure simulacrum, simulation, semblance. In the first case, the image is of a good appearance, representing a sacramental order. In other words, if we're going to look at the history and progression of presenting images, the first one essentially could be identified with theology. It is an attempt to understand an undergirding system from which we can relate the world together. In terms of our ability to conceive things through images and analogy, we can take a broader idea of what it means essentially to be the image. I mean, in medieval thinking, we just have to look at the discarded image, to use C.S. Lewis, understanding a cosmology where everything is interrelated, the memory palace, the idea of the art of memory, these, again, more medieval ideas sort of seeping in, and a sacramental order. If something is sacramental, then the image is referring to a greater eternal truth, which of course is the sacred, which of course is God, in which case it can really represent that true aspect of what it means to be an icon. In the second, that which denatures, it is an evil appearance. It is the order of maleficence. In other words, if it denatures reality, this is Gnosticism. It's the idea that the world with which we are presented, the icon, is nothing more than a obscuration of true reality, and part of a process of gnosis is coming to a purer understanding of what lies beyond the image, breaking through the image. And having just done a sort of deep dive into Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a lot of both one and two come across, but part of, you can say, the revolutionary impetus to break down societal structures, you can say, as a modern notion of this Gnosticism, that we have this denatured reality, essentially, which is presented to us, which breaks down in terms of our ability to shed light, to form an interaction with what lies beyond the image. This, in many ways, is representative of iconoclasm in its most sort of sincere form, the desire for the Byzantines to break down images, and indeed for Protestants all across Europe to break down the images, that it is the icon which is being worshipped and not which lies beyond the icon. In the third, where the image masks the absence of a profound reality, it plays at being an appearance. It is an order of sorcery. And again, this would almost sort of go into Cartesianism. René Descartes famously said that I think, therefore I am. But his whole basis, his principle, was founded on a skepticism, which almost became an absolute skepticism verging on nihilism. The only way, again, he was trying to rationalize how we can relate to the world is that if, again, what masks beyond is an absence, it could be a contrivance, the evil demon has created the world, all of my sensations are fake, all of my everything that simulates experience around me basically is given to me. And thus we see, you can almost say, baked into Cartesianism, there is a anticipation of the postmodernist here. There is a radical skepticism derived at objective truth. And so we arrive at this point where all of history, everything around us, can essentially be fake. In the fourth, it is no longer an order of appearances, but of simulation. In other words, we shouldn't be looking for the real when there is no reality. Everything is simply exists within the order of appearances. And of course, if you understand that there is no reality, then by extension, there is no history. But again, that's not simply to frustrate the point and accept Baudrillard's argument regarding how this is going to relate to the film based on first principles. Now, that would be a rather boring conversation if that were the case, especially as this is worthy of much greater interrogation. The transition from signs that dissimulate something to signs that dissimulate that there is nothing, marks a decisive turning point. The first reflects a theology, the second inaugurates the era of simulacra and simulation, in which there is no longer a God to recognize his own, no longer a last judgment to separate the false from the true, the real from its artificial resurrection, as everything is already dead and resurrected in advance. When the real is no longer what it was, nostalgia assumes its full meaning. There is a plethora of myths of origin and signs of reality, a plethora of truth, a secondary objectivity and authenticity. Escalation of the true, of lived experience, resurrection of the figurative, where the object and the substance have disappeared. Panic-stricken production of the real and of the referential, parallel to and greater than the panic of material production. This is how simulation appears. In other words, when you have the notion sort of inherited really from romantic nihilists that God is dead, we have destroyed the edifices of our certainty, of our understanding of a universal order. What are we going to make in replace of it? Now that we've essentially accepted that reality is what you make it, in many ways it's a creative expression. In the 19th century, of course, we have a lot of revivalisms, pagan revivalism, mythic revivalism. It's not, again, surprising that figures like Wagner, and indeed going back to the 20th century, like Tolkien, would emerge essentially in a world which seems to have lost the guiding force of certainty, of theology, of the ability to configure everything back to a certain state of truth. And therefore, when it comes to the lived experience, a plethora of truth, this is where we have aspects essentially of postmodernism, where the individual essentially becomes the source of truth. But that is certainly essentially not what Baudrillard is really offering. It's rather that whatever individual truths are presented to us, we essentially imbibe through this process of simulation. And it's from here that we finally get into the meat of this evening, which is to talk about how does this relate to film? Why I'm really interested in this topic. In a violent and contemporary period of history, let's say between the two world wars, it is a myth that invades cinema as imaginary content. It is the golden age of despotic and legendary resurrections. Myth, chased from the real by the violence of history, finds refuge in cinema. Myth, chased from the real by the violence of history, finds refuge in cinema. Again, it's this identification with history as not being essentially an extension of academia, but history being, almost to use sort of Samuel P. Huntington, the clash of civilizations, a process of the cult of death, the ascetic of death, rebirth, palingenesis, a process of metamorphosis, of becoming. When all, and I'm using sort of Spenglerian motifs as well, in addition to various other historians. Gabriel D'Annunzio is another example. If you almost sort of enter into a state beyond where death is held in the balance through the momentum of history, the idea again from Baudrillard is that cinema becomes that refuge. It becomes a collective conceit essentially to establish a new mythology. Today, it is history itself that invades the cinema according to the same scenario. The historical stake chased from our lives by coexistence on a global level and a pacified monotony. This history exercised by a slowly or brutally congealing society celebrates its resurrection in force on the screen, according to the same process that used to make lost myths live again. In terms of this idea of a coalescing of society, he often links these sort of groups, these expressions of culture, in other words, history depicted on film, as part of a mass energy. In other words, in order to, history itself is very individualistic. It's rather elite in terms of its serious interrogation, but globalizing a process. If you're going to again look at film in terms of box office receipts, in terms of some sort of collective watchers, then there is a mass quality which is essentially imbibed in history, and it's something that Wagner wrote of extensively, which is it wasn't simply a case that he had to write his operas. He needed to create Germans in order to understand his cinema. So what Baudrillard is basically saying is that there has to be a certain conditions in which there could be a societal structure which is capable of receiving film, but that in itself, the existence of such mass, collective, globalized, and by extension, a monotonous group of people who are willing to receive things passively is nothing more than the result of the fact that violence, history as events, history as traumatic incidences, has been replaced by something which is fundamentally banal, and that could be recreated in a safe and controlled environment. Um, to sort of bring this down on a lower level, if you watch the original Gladiator, it's essentially Commodus's argument, which is, what is the glory of Rome? I will give the people an image of glory and they will love me for it. That is effectively the simulation which is being played out here. History is our lost referential, that is to say, our myth. It is by virtue of this fact that it takes the place of myths on the screen. The illusion would be to congratulate oneself on this awareness of history on the part of cinema, as one congratulated oneself in the entrance of politics into the university. Before again I encounter that, if again history is so important, if we are to understand again that we should celebrate this idea of having the historical film, the historical epic, the fact that it could become ingratiated within a more sort of mainstream audience, a larger audience, means that history itself in some way is elevated. For Baudrillard, again, this would be a diminution of history. As for myself, I don't I don't take such a absolutist view when it comes to history sort of positioning itself in cinema. I think it comes with positives and negatives, which we'll get into throughout the course of this. Same misunderstanding, same mystification, politics in the university. Politics that enter the university are those of the same that come from history, a retro politics, emptied of substance, legalized in their superficial exercise, with the air of a game and a field of adventure. This kind of politics is the sexuality or permanent education that is nothing more than a posthumous liberalization. So what he's basically referring to is that, as with history, which is war, conflict, which is now brought into the arena of the screen, with politics again, which is no longer a case of live or die, in some instances at least. Yeah, we're no longer talking about the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, we're no longer talking about the Italian wars. Instead, we're going to be talking about European integration in a political science seminar. If we accept that principle, essentially, that politics can be reduced to what he was essentially referred to as this superficial legalized existence, it simply informs this notion that for Baudrillard, everything is a consequence of events, of conflict, and of action. And what we have again is nothing more than sanitized, uh, vanilla iterations of something. And if we are to look at them essentially as representing nothing, achieving nothing, in and of itself, then is effectively worse than useless. Now, this is an interesting segment which I was curious about incorporating, but I've decided on incorporating it, which is actually arriving at I would say, a leftist critique of the depiction of historical authenticity within film. And the reason why I think, again, it's important to interrogate this point of view, not only as an examination of Baudrillard as a thinker in all his facets, but as also to, I think, understand why there is such a academic and intellectual disdain directed, you can say, against the historical epic and the historical film. I mean, just in terms of the Nolan sort of criticism that's been coming out, which again is something that I've also covered on this channel. I was able to notice this, but there's not something unique to the Nolan film. It's something that proliferates a whole plethora of different historical epics, and therefore we'll get to the examination of this leftist critique. The great events of this period, so this is between the First and the Second World Wars, the great trauma is the decline of strong referentials, these death pangs of the real and of the rational that open onto an age of simulation. Again, what he means by strong referentials is the lived experience essentially of someone who suffered directly as a result of tragedy, trauma. So, for example, I focused on the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. Once you are so sort of adequately dispossessed of the movement, then it sort of progresses into myth and popular myth by extension, and academic history, as is essentially being represented here again, is also something that's acceptably sort of removed from the events, that it loses this connection and therefore loses part of its. I mean, we're going to talk about realism and we're going to be talking about the end of history. It's almost looking at history and politics as vital forces, living forces, as simply as opposed to something as mundane as a process, an intellectual process, one which I'm aware that I'm embarking on this evening. Take that as you will. Whereas so many generations, and particularly the last generation, so this is written in the 1980s, lived in the march of history in this euphoric or catastrophic expectation of a revolution. Today, one has the impression that history has retreated, leaving behind it an indifferent nebula, traversed by currents, but emptied of references. It is into this void that the phantasms of a past history recede, the panoply of events, ideologies, retro fashions, no longer so much because people believe in them or still place some hope in them, but simply to resurrect the period when at least there was history, at least when there was violence, when at least life and death were at stake. Indeed, going back to this period again, it's also, he referenced earlier, the necessity of nostalgia. Nostalgia becomes a political force and a cultural force, sincerely, essentially, when you've demythologized a certain population where there is no longer a strong set of what he's referred to as referentials, a common understanding or a communal ethic, let alone a religious ethic. Dispossess that, and you can say nostalgia is a second order effect of that. And from his point of view, it's nostalgia which is actually directed again that one had at one point lived. There was a vital essence in our existences, and that superficially, film is a process about trying to recreate an understanding that humanity was once in a situation essentially where we engaged in events, we simply didn't receive events, or a case of Baudrillard, that these events aren't even necessarily real or indicative of anything. Anything serves to escape this void, this leukemia of history and of politics, a hemorrhage of values. It is in proportion to this distress that all content can be evoked pell-mell, that all previous history is resurrected in bulk. A controlling idea no longer selects, only nostalgia endlessly accumulates. War, fascism, the pageantry of the Belle Epoque, or revolutionary struggles, everything is equivalent and mixed indiscriminately in the same morose and funereal exaltation, in the same retro fascination. Again, reading that, you can say the arguments appeal to all sides of the political spectrum, whether it be, again, the experience of looking at Vietnam films or even the poetry of World War One. You can be left with essentially with the expectation that all of these participants within this violence felt this great sense of post-traumatic distress, that they were in many ways, again, the cultural awakening was a vilification of the process of war. In some cases, that simply isn't the case. War, in many cases, acts as some sort of rebirth in terms of the individual experiencing violence again, and it becomes part of this struggle which persists really into the 1930s. And from the point of view of someone like a Baudrillard, in terms of looking at this as a broader leftist critique, feeds into the system of fascism. But when he's talking about the Belle Epoque, it's referring in particular to a nostalgia that affects the loss of civilization following the beginning of the First World War. You can say that this is part of the reason why Titanic, as a film, keeps sort of cropping up again and again in various manifestations. There have been about a dozen adaptations of the film Titanic in various forms, even though they all seem to have amalgamated into the Titanic film we have with James Cameron. But the notion with James Cameron that we have an image, a pastiche of a hierarchical civilization. We have this trite romance that crosses over societal lines, yet we also have this expectation of the doom. We have this expectation of hitting of the iceberg. It's not simply that we are, of course, hitting the physical iceberg, but using this again as an example of a trite attempt at trying to pour some semblance of the real, of events, of tragedy, of referentials into an event. Titanic has everything. Everyone is part of this great globalized experience that becomes the fascination of the world. And through the trite romance story, again, we try and personalize the experience to relate essentially to the psychology of the individuals who are imbibing it. But of course, the iceberg also represents Belle Epoque civilization. And so, therefore, sort of trying to, if we're trying to look at this from a historicist point of view, you can read all these interpretations into it, any number of interpretations. That's simply one. But then going on to this idea of revolutionary struggles. So in Moscow, the reenactment of the October Revolution, it becomes part of this grandiose pageantry that in Leningrad, or when was then Petrograd, in October, really November of 1917, there existed this great moment where history was made. In reality, as we all know, the October Revolution was in many ways a bit of a farce, and the provisional government had no sort of real sort of gumption to keep going. But as with the 10 days that shook the world with Sergei Eisenstein, it's this notion again that there was a real aspect of history where we have references, we have events, we have tragedy in all its sort of brutalist glory. And if only we could have been one of those happy few to have imbibed that experience. Perhaps again, linking back to Shakespeare and the humanism that comes across in Shakespeare, that talk about Richard III. Those they will regret not being those who fought with us. In this case, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and in other words, being able to situate oneself and making history. Everything is equivalent and is mixed indiscriminately in this morose funeral exaltation, the same retro fascination. Funeral exaltation, again, it's this notion that this is dead, history is dead, and all we are essentially doing is just replaying a greatest hits format, a understanding of the past which is built around the satisfaction of this idea of nostalgia. And if we are to look at historical films in that way, what ultimately did they signify? Well, for Baudrillard, it would be the end of history. It would be the triumph of the simulation. So what about this idea of, I would guess, the left critique and fascism in particular? There is, however, a privileging of the immediately preceding era. So he's referring to the 1930s. One can explain it by evoking the Freudian theory of fetishism. Trauma is similar to the discovery of the difference between the sexes in children, as serious, profound as irreversible. The fetishization of an object intervenes to obscure this unbearable discovery. But precisely, says Freud, this object is not just any object, it is often the last object perceived before the traumatic discovery. Thus, a fetishized history will preferably be the one immediately preceding the irreferential era, whence the omnipresence of fascism and of war in retro, a coincidence, an affinity that is not at all political. Is it naive to conclude that this evocation of fascism signals to a potential renewal? The reason why I focus on that argument in particular is that I think it actually explains so much of the academic criticism which is directed towards any notion towards historical fidelity. The irreferential era, what he's referring to in terms of the fetishization, the traumatic discovery, Freudianism, he's referring to the aspect that one side in the Second World War lost. And so there is this, from his point of view, the funeral oration, which is routinely played for that side within the conflict. there has to be some sort of process of renewal. But why does he fix his fetishization within fascism itself? Well, part of modern psychology, and this again is in many ways we're playing into more leftist tropes, is to try and pathologize a political orientation. And so he's almost using Freudianism and sexual imagery essentially to again undergird what sort of attitude is there to try and invoke the glory, the pageantry of fascism. But why, again, looking at this from a leftist point of view, why would fascism be so uniquely culpable of this? Why can't all ideologies engage in this reverence for the era of referentials where history was moving? All you need to do is point to any of 1,000 films about the Second World War in order to feel the same sensation. Why does he focus on fascism? It's because fascism, in many ways, relies on its pageantry to a greater extent than other ideologies. This isn't just his argument, this is also, I think, echoing with an aspect of my own, in that we're talking about the envelopment of myths, but also modernism, futurism, mass mobilization and energies, the cult of death and resurrection. However, all of these facts are to some extent politically prefigured. And so if we're going to look again at film, in the case of fascism, we look at the Italian film industry. In the case of National Socialism, you look to figures like not only Leni Riefenstahl, but Veit Harlan, films such as Jud Sus and Kohlberg. What effectively do they indicate again that, as with the Nuremberg rallies, so much of fascism basically is built around this spectacle of the coming sort of renewal or regeneration of the nation. It has a sacred character to it. It's part of this iconodualism, this desire to create a new iteration of the sacred image, the sacramental order, which is founded on the consecration of the new conception of rightist politics, of the new Germany. The Third Reich, in the case of Italy, again, that fascist Italy is both something which harkens to something ancient, yet also something that's radically new. So his logic is that because the ideologies of the right, which he's terming as fascism, uniquely sort of are reliant on these imagery, these referentials, as he's calling them, this desire to fuse myth, political order, the irrational, and rationalism. He's also called this an aspect of necessitated confusion in all of these ideologies. If you fuse them all together, and that becomes a central conceit, essentially, of academics, then the emphasis on the image, the emphasis on the funeration, the emphasis on historical fidelity, it shouldn't surprise you when so many academics look at historical distortionism. They say, oh no, what does it matter that Isaac Newton is being played by a black person? The only reason you want Isaac Newton to be played by a white person is not because it's any truer to the spirit of history, because, as you know, Isaac Newton is dead. He's been dead for 300 years. What is more important is that you have a particular conception, a hallowed, sacred conception of the nation projected into the past, and you desire to create an image which will prefigure a renewal, a political system for the future. So, in terms, again, of just trying to understand how sort of omni-political Baudrillard's assessment here is, it's not just that cinema represents the death of history, it's that the end of fascism, in particular, represents, you can say, this grievance process, this fetishization directed towards the end of a period of violence where history has a motivating impetus force behind it. Again, this is not something I would localized to fascism, but you can understand, I hope, from my presentation of the argument, why leftists would attach themselves to this theory, why essentially they would look to historical fidelity as nothing more than a Trojan horse, and therefore, by extension, that none of these presentations, these simulations, can represent any true history. But moving away from this argument, history has made its triumphal entry into cinema. Posthumously, in other words, because history is dead. The term historical has undergone the same fate historical moment, a monument, a congress, a figure are in this way designated as fossils. Its reinjection has no value as conscious awareness, but only as nostalgia for a lost referential. It's very interesting in a way because look at a monument, say, for example, a statue of Robert E. Lee. Yes, I think it's fair to say that a statue of Robert E. Lee says as much about the culture that would honor that figure in the same way you can have a statue of any figure. Any beautiful or grotesque monument signifying something will tell you a bit about what that culture basically elevates. But in terms of this identification of like a historical monument, like UNESCO, for example, preservationism, heritage, the historical figure, he again sees this as all part of this establishment of nostalgia, that history has ended in the way that I was alluding to earlier, in hyperreality. History is instead something we attach to these monuments, and as a result, we fetishize them. We fetishize the castle, which no longer serves any practical purpose. We fetishize the cathedral in a society which has more or less again gone over to irreligion, if not atheism. We fetishize the monument, which signifies a heroic quality in an individual from a time which is so removed from us that it bears no resemblance to our times, and thereby history is dead. In the same way, what is a historical film? A historical film is not a reenactment, but it's an attempt again to re-gauge this process of nostalgia. The more you sort of look into the argument, it has a consistency to it. This does not signify that history has never appeared in cinema as a powerful moment, as a contemporary process, as insurrection and not simple resurrection. And in that, again, process, you would identify history as art. The notion of resurrection is something that I've been encountering a lot. There's a historian of modernism within the right called Roger Griffin, who I may plan on doing a video on at one point, who focuses on this notion of right-wing politics in the 1930s as all relating back to palingenesis, the notion of to be born again, resurrection, and the notion again that that cannot be history, that it's only the insightful incident, the moment of societal erosion or rebellion that represents a historical artifact or monument or piece of art. Again, I think this relates to part of, again, a certain political bent that legitimizes one part of the political spectrum and not the other. So, for example, Roger Griffin would understand that modernism in the right, fascism, represents as much a complex of resistance and insurrection as it also does a process of resurrection. So to distinguish these ideas again would seem not very charitable. In the real, as in cinema, there was history, but there isn't any more. Today, the history that is given back to us, precisely because it was taken from us, in other words, in the post-Second World War consensus, had no more of a relation to historical real than neo-configuration in painting does to classical configuration of the real. Neo-figuration is an invocation of resemblance, but at the same time, the flagrant proof of the disappearance of objects is their very representation, hyperreal. It's part of this notion that in the medieval times, we don't have this emphasis on academic painting. We don't have this notion that we want to create a historicized period where there is fidelity to how objects should have looked, to how people should have dressed. Instead, things are presented in a contemporary manner. I will always sort of go back to the sort of seminal conversation on this, as far as I'm concerned, is Koselleck's dialogue on Altdorfer. Altdorfer and his Battle of Issus, and how it all relates to a whole sort of Christian unraveling at the time of the Reformation. But Darius and Alexander the Great are basically portrayed as Austrians and Ottomans. They're not portrayed in a very sort of historically relevant matter. But the point of view in terms of looking at this as resurrection. What is real? What is a better sort of substance or an artifact of history? Something which says so much about a culture that views a certain event and tries to find an analog of it in the past, whether it be the Siege of Vienna in 1529 and the Battle of Issus, or an attempt to demonstrate the Rankian argument, wie es eigentlich gewesen, something as it actually happened. Now, what does that mean? What is more valuable to us? Is this all, again, just a subjective quality where it all relates to the beholder or the historian, again, who is trying to interrogate a certain reality? So this is the whole idea of neo-figuration. I think all the process of history could be described, as Baudrillard is using this word, neo-figuration, because the original figuration is dead. And I think actually this would be a testament to a fundamental misunderstanding on the part of Baudrillard, which is that history isn't figuration. History is only the figuration of events in the sense that these are the events which take place within a historical record. But that, funnily enough, would actually lean back to a lot of, I would say, superficial tropes about history, that these events are almost self-evident. The historian isn't necessarily the one imbibing an event with significance. Whereas, as I'm going to read with R.G. Collingwood, and this is my own belief, the historical real is neo-figuration. It's not simply that the event is there and it's so self-evident that it becomes a historical event. No, it becomes part of a greater understanding. It becomes part of the historian's interrogation. All historians interacting with history, from Herodotus onwards, is a process of neo-figuration. Herodotus wasn't figuring the Greco-Persian Wars in the 5th century. Herodotus was neo-figuring the wars in that sense. So perhaps again, this is a tell in the sense when he's talking about the end of history. This is a history which is dispossessed of the historian, which is completely consistent with his admonition towards the political scientist within the academy. And by extension, what really matters is not the historian, not even necessarily the artist. My argument would be that in trying to represent a sense of a real historical event, the artist in many ways is a historian, or at least should try and adopt that mentality. The more, again, the historian and the artist become separated when it comes to a historical film, the more problems will start to emerge. But all of these things don't really factor in. All that sort of factors in is the meta-commentary regarding politics, propaganda, trying to create a structured reality through these images, and the effects it has on a passively imbibing population, appealing to this notion fundamentally of nostalgia. Therein objects shine in a sort of hyper-resemblance, like history and contemporary cinema, that makes it that so fundamentally they no longer resemble anything, except the empty figure of resemblance, the empty form of representation. It is a question of life or death. These objects are no longer either living or deadly. This is why they are so exact, so minute, frozen in the state in which brutal loss of the real would have seized them. All, but not only, those historical films, whose very perfection is disquieting, such as Chinatown, 3 Days of the Candor, Barry Lyndon, 1900, All the President's Men, etc. One of the impression of it being a question of perfect remakes, of extraordinary montages that emerge from a combinatory culture of large photo, kino, historico-synthesis, machines, etc., rather than one of veritable films, whatever essentially he means by that. Now, trying to really understand what he's saying here, that these events, these films, these images, they have been seized. You can say this about any, academic quote-unquote work of art, or any work of art which tries to depict an event using some form of realism, or in the case of Baudrillard, as he'd refer to it, an aspect of hyperrealism, the frozen moment. This isn't something unique to film, and it's not something I think should be uniquely applied to the notion of film. It's something that could be applied to any monument. It's essentially the basis of Shelley and his poem Ozymandias, the whole notion that, yes, the world changes, history is the process of change, but here we have a signification that at one point history, civilization, the order of the world was different, if not to remind ourselves that all of this is transitory, that these things live in a state of perpetual change, that anything representing eternity has to be indicative of something beyond the human, which effectively is again bound to die. Remember, you will die. So I don't see this really as a great problem, nor do I see this as fundamentally indicative that cinema itself should herald the day where history effectively ends. You could almost say that any attempt to immortalize something, and moreover, that these events, these images, these frozen objects can survive, is a testament to the end of history, and I don't think necessarily that argument follows. The problem is rather that in some sense we are left completely indifferent when it comes to quality. Take the last picture show, images referred to here. Like me, you would have to be sufficiently distracted to have thought it to be the original production from the 1950s, a very good film about the customs in and the atmosphere of an American small town. Just a slight suspicion. It was a little too good, more in tune, better than others, without the psychological, moral, and sentimental blotches of the films of that era. Stupefaction when one discovers that it is a 1970s film, perfect retro, purged, pure, the hyper-realist restitution of the 1950s cinema. One talks of remaking silent films. Those will also doubtlessly be better than those of the period. A whole generation of films is emerging. There will be those one knew, what the android is to man, marvelous artifacts without weakness, pleasing simulacra that lack only the imaginary and the hallucination inherent to cinema. Indeed, this whole notion of the 1970s recreating a stupefied iteration of something that existed in the 1950s, someone like Baudrillard, especially being a postmodernist, should recognize that it's not simply a process of trying to create such a absolute hyper-realist interpretation of something that all it does is bear considerations to other 1950s film, rather that implicitly, if we're going to look at this as a generational divide between filmmakers and intentions, that the values and the environments in the 1970s are somewhat reflected back on the attitude of the 1950s. And watching the last picture show, that is certainly the impression I have. I mean, just in terms of, again, absence of sentimental blotches, that itself is indicative of a cultural shift. If anything, that's more of a subtle indicator of change. I mean, everything is the same superficially. Everything brings to mind again a atmosphere, an aesthetic of the 1950s. Yet the culture that's produced it essentially has different values from that essentially which has received, imbibed, and significantly, and that should be treated as a historical development, a historical fact. These aren't stifling. This doesn't exist simply as a intention of recreating something in the 1950s. Rather, as with all processes of history, it's a new coalescing of certain factors into something new. Most of what we see today is already of this type of order. Barry Lyndon is the best example. One never did better. One will never do better. In what? Not in evoking, not even in evoking and stimulating. All the toxic radiation has been filtered. All the ingredients are there in precise doses, not a single error. Kubrick, who manipulates his film like a chess player, who makes an operational scenario of history, and this does not return to the old opposition between the spirit of finesse and the spirit of geometry. That opposition still comes from the game and the stakes of meaning, whereas we are entering an era of films that in themselves no longer have meaning, strictly speaking, an era of great synthesizing machines, of varying geometry. That is, you can say, I hate to say the standard interpretation of Barry Lyndon, that it's the victim of its own dejection, its lack of humanity, its coldness. I, of course, have done, alongside John Dee, a review of Barry Lyndon on this channel, and my issue with Barry Lyndon is that I've judged it as an adaptation, and as an adaptation, it divorces Barry Lyndon, the character, and I would argue, it doesn't necessarily fetishize the setting, as Baudrillard would use that language. Um, if you're sort of reading Stanley Kubrick and his argumentation, this is almost like a second order effect from the research he'd done about Napoleon. But the impression that critics and I had at the time is that this is a very romantic piece, it's a nostalgic piece. It is, in part, as Baudrillard was referring to here, cinema as a funeral oration. It was an elegy. It was a poem which was composed to refer to the era that was lost with the French Revolution, going back to the example of Napoleon. And it fixates on the idea of the aristocratic culture, which its sort of greatest expressions, gambling and violence, and the duel being the repeated motifs throughout that film. And as a result, the actual character of Lyndon Barry is lost within that. He instead essentially becomes nothing more than a signifier for a desperate desire to appeal to enter into this culture, which is, as with the American Revolution during the events of the film and the French Revolution after the events of the film, is rapidly disappearing. And Kubrick, within the film, notices this not only with the defeat and the loss of Lyndon's position. It's also with the reference to the music. There's a desire, especially with Handel in particular, to evoke a certain feeling within the audience. And with Hogarth's paintings in particular, this is one example of many references to 18th century paintings. So it's as much it's almost like an integrative history in the sense that it appeals to music, it appeals to art, and it appeals to this notion of what it meant to be an aristocrat. It's more of a social history than anything in an artistic and cultural history, more than it is a traditional narrative focusing on Barry. But the film ends with the use of Schubert, which Kubrick emphasized directly because he wanted to refer to a period which indicates this sense of loss. You can look at it superficially and say that, all of these elements are nothing but mechanical, cold, deprived of anything which represents vitality within history, which is Baudrillard's central conceit. History is event-driven, history is living. Instead, reduce it to the spirit of what he refers to as geometry. But again, in terms of looking at historical films as artifacts and saying this is the end of history, no, I would say that Barry Lyndon, whatever objections I have to it in terms of a narrative and in terms of its fidelity to Thackeray, is very interesting. I also think it's, if we're going to look at film as nostalgia, it's also indicative of a lost art in many ways. I don't believe I've really seen a film like Barry Lyndon, post Barry Lyndon, that attempts to achieve something like this. And I think it's actually an extension of the fact that Barry Lyndon in many ways was a failure. It tries to represent something, and it tries to represent something in a new synthesis. Part of the whole process of filmmaking, and what makes filmmaking, you can say, in many ways, if not necessarily superior, definitely a more complex and multifaceted expression of art, is the fact they can synthesize all of these elements together and represent the tragedy, the imagery, the music, the acting. This is, where Wagner talks about the total work of art. It sort of has an expression in film, and I believe if Wagner had lived 50 years later, he would have been a filmmaker. History is a strong myth, perhaps along the unconscious, the last great myth. It is a myth that at once subtended the possibility of an objective enchainment of events and causes the possibility of a narrative enchainment of discourse. The age of history, if one can call it that, is also the age of the novel. It is this fabulous character, the mythical energy of an event or of a narrative that today seems increasingly lost. Behind a performative and demonstrative logic, the obsession with historical fidelity, with a perfect rendering, as elsewhere an obsession with real time, this negative and implacable fidelity to the materiality of the past, to a particular scene of the past or of the present, to the restitution of an absolute simulacrum of the past or the present, which was substituted for all other value. We are all complicitous in this, and this is irreversible, because cinema itself contributed to the disappearance of history and to the advent of the archive. Photography and cinema contributed in large part to the secularization of history, to fixing it on the invisible, objective form at the expense of the myths that once traversed it. Today, cinema can place all of its talent, all of its technology in the service of reanimating what itself contributed to liquidating it, and only resurrects ghosts, and it is lost therein. I read quite a lot of T.S. Eliot in that particular description, the notion that the television is something to be rejected on the basis that it homogenizes. Also, this idea that the film presents us with an attempt to effectively collectivize a mass appreciation of a certain event within history. That is something that we should reject, apparently. Now, this is where it really comes to presenting the counterpoint, which is something that Baudrillard doesn't refer to, which is how does the historian figure into this? And how do we draw the line between how the historian receives something versus how a population at large should necessarily revere something? Another, again, subtle reference to the point that he brings up the image of God. History is secularized. My own identification with history as a subject is that history is always secularized. That's what makes it essentially history. If history were written about the gods, or history were again trying to indicate something of the divine, not just within the Christian context, but also within the Greek context, then it would be necessarily theology. In the same way that if we're going to be talking about a notion of objective reality, which relates to events rather than the simulation or nostalgia for these events, then that true isn't necessarily history. But going back to the whole notion of fascism and the recreation of the aesthetic around death and regeneration, resurrection, accepting that that is history is in many cases, I believe, a very Jungerian, Ernst Junger, perception of history itself, which is that history speaks through the actions of the heroic, the great man. And we shouldn't, again, be relating this all to humans and interpretation and intersubjectivity. And that is simultaneously an incredibly, incredibly right-wing interpretation of history. So how do we sort of, I guess, ground this within a more, for lack of a better word, a more mainstream perspective on history? I reference R.G. Collingwood at the beginning of this conversation, and the point again is to say that he was a great formative influence. A lot of the historians I reference, I would say, are on a level which is very hard to digest for people with a casual understanding of history. I would say that R.G. Collingwood is one of these thinkers which is far more accessible. And I would say once you really sort of begin to receive the bulk of his ideas, they really help in terms of beginning to form a critical, analytical understanding of how history works. And again, to provide that counterpoint to Baudrillard, Collingwood, being a historian, in his idea of history, says that history is not a spectacle. The events of history do not pass and review before the historian. He has to recreate them inside his own mind, reenacting for himself so much of the experience, the men who took part in them, as he wishes to understand. In other words, for Collingwood, what distinguishes the film, the historical film, and the understanding essentially that one is to receive, one is not supposed to critique or analyze, that essentially is what separates the historian. It is that process of engagement. It is not a passive surrender to the spell of another's mind. It is a labor of active and therefore critical thinking. The historian not only reenacts the past in thought, he reenacts it in the context of his own knowledge, and therefore in reenacting it, he criticizes it, forms his own judgment of its value, corrects whatever errors he can discern from it. The criticism of the thought whose history he traces is not something secondary to tracing the history of it. It is an indispensable condition of historical knowledge. Nothing could be a more complete error concerning the history of thought than to suppose that the historian as such merely ascertains. The reenactment of past thought is not a precondition of historical knowledge, but an integral element in it. The effect of the contention is to make such knowledge impossible. An act of thought, by becoming subjective, ceases to be objective, and thus, by becoming present, ceases to be past. That's really what I meant in terms of all history becoming neofiguration. Without this process of neofiguration, it is history without the historian, which, as far as I'm concerned, isn't history, at least in the academic sense. The difference between memory and history is that whereas memory, the past, is spectacle, in history it is reenacted in present thought. So far as the thought is thought about, the past is thought of as being reenacted. Any of my knowledge of myself is historical knowledge. Now, what Baudrillard is essentially referring to, if we're going to try and understand it through this Collingwood criticism, is he's not talking about history. He's talking about the fetishization of a conception of historical memory. He's also affording no critical or analytical ability from the audience. Moreover, he's actually discounting the idea that historians themselves can watch films and judge them as historical artifacts. Though that is what I do. When judging a film, I actively engage and look beyond the spectacle. I advocate that we do not receive things passively. Even if there are superficial elements of the film that please the senses, we shouldn't become subdued or sort of consumed by that process. I mean, uh, again, this is part of the reason I think figures like David Lynch have an appeal, in the sense that he is actively sort of goading the audience in order to interpret something which, on the first glance or superficially, may seem contradictory or senseless. The idea that we are these passive receptacles, that we imbibe these events. So I guess the question is, coming out of all of this, engagement with film is possible. A creative impetus behind cinema is possible. History can be melded with the effects of film in order to try and represent something which is truer to the spirit of the past. I believe that's possible. And it all comes with the condition that we shouldn't accept this as a surrender. But that again is assuming a great level of intelligence on the part of the audience. I think the issue in terms of this devolving into pure simulacra, where we simply look at this as nothing more than nostalgia for the loss of the event, for the loss of the referential, tragedy, violence, what have you, is if you deny this capacity to the audience, it's all just a process of psychology. It's all a process of fetishization. And, to some extent, he is true, but this is why filmmaking to me, historical recreation, reenactment, is so important, because I understand how damaging it can be. I understand how, if you have a completely warped construction of events with a very overt narrative welded to it, I mean, I've covered this in many of the films I've encountered on this channel, then that is cinema as the death of history. This is cinema which is corrupted and used to serve a political or a propagandistic or cultural agenda. In many cases, films achieve this with, you can argue, spectacular results. In other instances, they become so blatant that the population sort of rejects them almost unconsciously, in terms of seeing something so out of place that it revolts against this idea of verisimilitude, the spirit of truth in and itself. This is all very significant, and it comes back to this notion that it is possible, I think, to use film as a historical tool in order to bring about engagement, but also, the fetishization, like we see at Barry Lyndon ostensibly, the fetishization of the past, of a desire to recreate Hogarth, the images, etc. Why, you know, a priori is that a bad thing necessarily? Interestingly enough, Baudrillard talks about the greatest examples. We have so many examples of botched historical reenactments, sort of terrible films. Unfortunately, a lot of modern films, but Barry Lyndon isn't one of these. And I think given how sort of passive and how visual the film is in terms of its language, it is one of these things where people, I would say, aren't just passively imbibing. I think they are more critically engaged in their surroundings. They're using all of their senses to interact with all of these things. And so, if we're going to look at history as an idea of engagement, and also it's not just engagement with the work that's presented here, but it's an engagement with the intentions of the people behind it, of their attitudes and whatever. Again, it can be a very rewarding experience in the same way that I talked about the picture show and how that was, in many ways, again, a commentary, which was more reflective of the 1970s, looking back on the 1950s, and how culture has changed definitively within those years, and how, again, there is something to comment on that, other than simply looking at this hyperrealism and saying it signifies nothing. It's just a pretty image, in the same way that Altauthor, historical fiction, paintings before, the academic style, the fact that they choose to represent certain characters in certain guises, either with a attempt to create a fidelity to the past or a desire to completely appropriate image to a romantic sort of ideal of the past, all of these things again are historically relevant. They all relate to something. They tell you something about the author, and again, that helps us get into the mind of those people who created it. I think going back to, again, my last review, The Odyssey, something I found so contemptuous about it is that the film maker Christopher Nolan seemed to be so aware of all of this, and he seemed to be deliberately trolling people who were looking for aspects of verisimilitude, of fidelity, whether it was of a fidelity to the past in Greece or it was a fidelity to the, for the lack of a better expression, the spirit of Homer. So I almost think that if you basically say that cinema is the end of history, everything is simulation, and so we should play around almost exclusively with the audience and its interaction, then you again have created a different form of work. You have almost created a there is no attempt to basically establishing history when you're almost inviting solely a attempt to troll your audience and create a cultural commentary on modernity in itself. That's how something essentially like the Odyssey should be presented. People saying, "Oh well, it's nothing more than you shouldn't consider these arguments, these postmodern arguments." There is nothing about the film that isn't postmodern in terms of its core. It's all about audience and audience reactions and audience perceptions. It is the antithesis, you can say, of an attempt at hyperrealism. Why should we opt essentially for one extreme over the other? Why should we abandon all essential attempts of fidelity, or indeed denigrate these aspects of fidelity and say that this is all part of a political agenda, which is rooted again in the fetishization of a period where we had events, where we had violence? And this comes back to the idea of, is the historical film a true icon? Is it an attempt to invoke a presence of God or the real? And if this were true, then the question basically says that, okay, well, the reason we shouldn't look for fidelity in the past, the reason we shouldn't be fixated on a sacred image, a reality, is that from a Christian point of view or a religious point of view, then that in itself becomes an act of idolatry. History in itself becomes idolatrous through our desire to create a truthful or an accurate depiction. That again is an argument I've been hearing quite a lot recently. So I want to go back to Baudrillard and focus on what he has to say about this, the icon, the divine image. The question returns to religion and the simulacrum of divinity. I forbade that there be any simulacra in the temple, because the divinity that animates nature can never be represented. Indeed, it can be. But what becomes of the divinity when it reveals itself in icons, when it multiplied in the simulacra? Does it remain in the supreme power that it simply incarnated in images as a visible ideology? Or does it volatilize itself in the simulacra that alone deploy their power and pomp of fascination, the visible machinery of icons substituted for the pure and intelligible idea of God? This is precisely what was feared by iconoclasts, whose millennial quarrel is still with us today. This is precisely because they predicted the omnipotence of a simulacra, the faculty Simulacra had of effacing God from the conscience of man and the destructive, annihilating truth that they allow to appear, that deep down God never existed, that only the simulacra ever existed, even that God himself was never anything but his own images. Simulacra comes from this. They came, their urge to destroy the images. If they could have believed that these images only obfuscated or masked the Platonic idea of God, there would have been no reaction to destroy them. One can live with the idea of distorted truth, but their metaphysical despair came from the idea that the image didn't conceal anything, and that these images were, in essence, not images, such as an original model would have made them, but perfect simulacra, forever radiant, with their own fascination. Thus, the death of the divine referential. Now, that again sort of is a far more potent argument against the fetishizations of film. If it is possible to create a definitive edition of something, say, for example, if we are going to say Barry Lyndon is the definitive edition of how we should perceive the end of aristocracy as a really a momentous force within European history. This idea essentially of creating a totalizing icon, something that can stand in place of real history, local mythologies, individual interpretations, is something that I will later encounter with Disney, and I'll refer to that with Baudrillard again on a different stream, which I have planned. But that is significant, that the historical film can become such a strong referential that it becomes a monolith. And I do believe there are many examples, almost too many to point out, where the film, let's take Braveheart, for example, the film becomes so much stronger than the history that in itself represents the death of history. It becomes the death of any desire to interrogate beyond, to look deeper into the causes, to deconstruct, to disentangle, and instead we are presented with, again, it's not just a falsehood. In the case of using the example of Braveheart and relaying this back to the idea of a simulacra, it represents the end of history in the sense that it is hyperreality. The myth about Scottish oppression that was contrived in that film is stronger than any reality, to the point that it has become a political force. So much, I believe, of Scottish nationality is, a lot of leftists would look to Birth of a Nation, and the rise of the second Ku Klux Klan in 1915. But I think something like Braveheart is far more pertinent an example in terms of its lasting relevance, especially within the United Kingdom. So take that example, that definitive iteration essentially of what it means to be a Scottish nationalist in the medieval period, as anachronistic as these terms will be. The fact that we're taking so many ideas, disjointed ideas, contradictory ideas, ahistorical ideas, we are formalizing them and we have created an image. In that sense, again, the historian isn't there making the film. He isn't there kind of like Stanley Kubrick attempting to play this role of the creative and the historian. Rather, it is almost, one is obliged as a historian to become the iconoclast in that situation, to deconstruct and destroy the edifice of that film. But on another level, the historian can simply position himself in a situation where, no, I have not decided to recover the true history behind this simulation, this hyper-real sort of notion of Scottish nationality. Rather, I have decided to comment on the meta itself. And so, yes, on the one hand, it is the death of history, yet it's also the reinvigoration of history. To comment on an artifact which becomes a moment of historical actions, historical drivers. There'll be an interesting question to ask whether the 2014 Scottish referendum on independence could have happened were it not for the film Braveheart, for example. You can say that this isn't a dramatic event, this isn't an event invoking conflict, this isn't the Easter Rising in 1916. Rather, this is a safe, sanitized, controlled experiment in the possibility of independence. And I'm not saying that's untrue. I actually believe that. I believe that fundamentally, that that's exactly what the intention of the Prime Minister at the time was, David Cameron, was to create a hyper-real sense of political participation in that independence referendum. But if you're going to look at it, historically, Braveheart plays a role in that. And it becomes incumbent on the historian in terms of being able to understand that. So superficially, look at Braveheart and say it is the simulation, it is the end of history. Yet on another level, no, it's simply again an indicator that history is continuing, albeit with these false images. And again, that's to again imply that cinema is uniquely culpable of this. As I mentioned with my Ozymandias example, it's not. It's possible to create fabrications and treatises throughout history. The donations of Constantine, the idea that Pope Sylvester gifted the sort of temporal dominion of the Western Roman Empire to the papacy. That is one of the most momentous, fabrications in medieval history. And it was a fabrication, but so is Braveheart. Does the fact that history could be fabricated, the fact that there is, I mean, this is why history is so important in terms of identifying a fidelity to the texts one encounters, trying to ascertain their veracity and to compare them and contrast them, yet also to understand if they are fake, that they themselves become historical artifacts in terms of the events that they inform and the civilizations and sort of cultural changes that they affect. History is so much more versatile than simply looking at it from the idea of you can say that a Lynchian caricature of what it means to passively imbibe television, to imbibe film, which is that we are all just treated like the positivists, where we have history is just written out in front of us. The historian is simply there to explain what is already there, um, which isn't true, sort of by any means or sort of notion of the imagination. But I want to finish this conversation because I believe you can say I've interrogated this notion enough, and I was only planning on going for an hour and a half anyway, more like 2 hours, to talk about really the last aspect of this regarding film and history that Baudrillard talks about, which is his opinions on Apocalypse Now, which, as far as I'm concerned, can relate back to this idea of historical distortionism and the leftist critique that historical fidelity is nothing other than nostalgia or indeed advocacy for fascism. Francis Ford Coppola makes his film like the Americans made war. It is the best possible testimonial with the same immoderation, the same excessive means, the same monstrous candor, and the same success. This, of course, the Vietnam War. The war as entrenchment, as technological and psychedelic fantasy. The war as a succession of special effects. The war become film, even before being filmed. The war abolishes itself in its technological test. And for Americans, it was primarily that, a test site, a gigantic territory in which to test their arms, their methods, and their power. That's certainly one interpretation of the Vietnam War. Coppola does nothing but that, test cinema's power of intervention, test the impact of a cinema that has become an immeasurable machinery of special effects in this sense. His film is really the extension of the war through other means, the pinnacle of this failed war, and its apotheosis. The war became film, the film becomes war. The two are joined by their common hemorrhage into technology. The real war is waged by Coppola, as it is by Westmoreland, without counting the inspired irony of having forests in the Philippine villages napalm to retrace the hell of South Vietnam. One revisits everything through cinema, and one begins again the Molochian joy of filming, the sacrificial joy of so many millions spent, of such a holocaust of means, of so many misadventures, and the remarkable paranoia that from the beginning conceived of this film as a historical global event, in which, in the mind of the creator, the war in Vietnam would have been nothing other than what it is, will not fundamentally have existed, and it is necessary for us to believe in this. The war in Vietnam in itself perhaps in fact never happened. It is a dream, a baroque dream of napalm and of the tropics, a psychotropic dream that had the goal neither of victory nor of policy at stake, but rather the sacrificial, excessive deployment of a power already filming itself as it unfolded, perhaps waiting for nothing but consecration by a superfilm, which completes the mass spectacle effect of this war. No real distance, no critical sense, no desire for raising consciousness in relation to the war, And in a sense, this is the brutal quality of this film, not being rotten with the moral psychology of war. Coppola can certainly deck out the helicopter captain in a ridiculous hat of light cavalry, make him crush the Vietnamese village to the sound of Wagner's music, in particular the Cavalcade of the Valkyrie. Those who are not critical, distant signs, they are immersed in the machinery, they are part of the special effect, and he himself makes movies in the same way, with the same retro megalomania, the same non-signifying furor, with the same clownish effect in overdrive. But there it is. He hits us with that. It is there, it is bewildering, and one can say to oneself, how is such horror possible? But there is no answer, there is no possible verdict, and one can rejoice in a monstrous trick, exactly as with Wagner. But one can always retrieve a tiny little idea that is not nasty and is not a value judgment, but tells you the war in Vietnam and this film are cut from the same cloth, that nothing separates them, that this film is part of the war. If the Americans seemingly lost the other one, they would certainly have won this one. Apocalypse Now is a global victory, cinematography power equal and superior to that of industry, and military complexes equal or superior to that of the Pentagon and of governments. That again is a variation on the theme, what I brought up earlier with the historicized necessity of Francis Fukuyama almost representing a hyperreal moment. His ideology was needed at the point of the unipolar moment. That again, if you read history divorced from the facts, or again discount the idea that the facts themselves exist, as in the case of looking at everything through simulacra. But I want to relay this back to the notion of, before getting onto technology, on the notion of Wagner. Because, of course, Wagner is a motif that is used during that strike. I almost think that Wagner was actually the impetus, perhaps more so than the desire simply to recreate that scene. Because when I read so much of Baudrillard, I am thinking of Nietzsche. Nietzsche reviles against this inauthentic attempt to recapture the past and his own experiences with philology and ancient classics within the university system. By reference, Nietzsche was at the time the youngest professor at a European university at the age of 24, but he rejected the university system and became an independent scholar. And I think if we're going to look at the same logic of the sanitized nature of how the academy basically purports to represent itself, in other words, divorced from the event, divorced from the referential, the violence, the conflict within history, then that would follow in the same logic. Nietzsche and Baudrillard seem to be cut from the same cloth in that regard. But I reference Wagner because I come from a rather unique position in the sense that I encounter Nietzsche through Wagner, not vice versa. I've been a Wagnerian since I was very young. And so I started to read Nietzsche as an extent of his Bayreuth experiences. For reference, Bayreuth is the great festival house of the canon operas of Wagner, where the first full cycle of the Ring of the Nibelungen was performed in 1876. I reference this because Nietzsche famously broke with Wagner during the first festival on the basis that Nietzsche had ascertained that Wagner was using new technology. He was redesigning the whole basis from which the German audience is to receive the opera, which is no longer in terms of the hierarchical Baroque opera house which he found in Bayreuth, the Mozart house, but as a mass for the new Germany. And Wagner in many ways was acting like a sorcerer. You can say again, trying to indicate a reality, but a reality of what? Part of Wagner's readings are heavily indebted to Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer speaks of this futility beyond artistic expression. But if one accepts that, one has to accept that art itself is an escape from nihilism, and it's an escape from this futility of existence, but that, as far as I'm concerned, also portrays an aspect of futility within the enterprise itself, and I think Nietzsche was aware of that. Moreover, Nietzsche was concerned that this was intentionally, in terms of the egalitarianism of Wagner, his revolutionary impetus, he was creating an attempt to create a new consciousness, a new audience, a new series of Germans. This came only 5 years after German unification in 1871, and Wagner needed to create Germans before he was able to create his opera series. You can say it was almost politically timed as with Vico, this would almost seem to be an expression that the ring cycle only exists within simulation. It is a desire to create a formalized system of myths, coalescing from these more localized myths and try to create a standardized version of it, as with film, as with Braveheart. It's creating a mythic prehistory for Germany, and it's trying to again create the expression, the nostalgia for events for heroism in the character of Siegfried. And in deliberately sort of appealing to the masses and making this a cultural experience for a new nation, Nietzsche reviled against this. Nietzsche believed that this was pandering, and this was, fundamentally, you could say, more than sort of democratic. It was demagoguery in a sense, and so he implicitly rejects this and sort of moves on. I believe that there is an aspect of the Nietzschean argument which is following into all such developments that could radically redefine culture and the expression of culture at that time. Wagner was, in his total work of art, fusing together elements of theatre, Greek tragedy, the new design and the architecture of his Bayreuth festival house, the political circumstances that will encounter it. He was creating something fundamentally new, in the same way that the American audience, and creating Hollywood, was at the time creating something that is fundamentally new, iterating on the technology and creating a new culture. You can say if Americanism is associated with commercialization, the commoditization of everything, and this fundamental expression of mass culture, it necessarily comes an extension of Hollywood, of cinema, of the desire to appropriate everything to itself and regurgitate something which is palatable. In that sense, again, it could represent the end of history, or it could represent a serious intellectual interrogation, which is why I believe actually the Baudrillardian examples are actually quite bad in terms of exhibiting this point. But why focus on something like Apocalypse Now? I think it actually speaks to something which is, using his own methodology. It's more than America expanding the scope of filmmaking. In the same way that we see the bombing campaign in North Vietnam, or we see America just having an opportunity to use its toys. Um, I don't interpret the Vietnam War that way, but you can interpret the Vietnam War and the Apocalypse Now, kind of in the same way that Baudrillard views the Watergate scandal, which got rid of Richard Nixon, which is that the system around Richard Nixon needed some form of political exorcism to get rid of the demons. The Nixon system was accused of corruption, and Nixon was presented effectively as a scapegoat in order to allow for the American political system to renew and undergo a sense of cultural rejuvenation. In terms of actually extending this into Vietnam, these two things are related. Nixon, of course, was the last Vietnam president. Johnson had got America into the war. Nixon was the one responsible for ending it. He was also the one responsible for losing the war. And part of the ending of the Nixon era is not simply a matter of basically saying that the American sort of press can be heralded as these trusted sources. These are the people speaking truth to power. They are cleansing America in order to rejuvenate. The political class can satisfy itself that they have scapegoated and placed America's political sins onto this one character. That is the Baudrillardian interpretation of this. As with Apocalypse Now, it's, as far as I'm concerned, it would follow a similar function. It's not simply a matter of demonstrating the developments of American technology in war and in cinema, and therefore, again, another extension of American imperialism and power. For Baudrillard, it would be that Apocalypse Now is a cleansing moment, is that the American military-industrial complex, which Baudrillard refers to here, is trying to create a emotional distance between the American population and the war. It's trying to begin a process of healing after the Vietnam War, and to almost basically create in a strange way another system of never again. That Vietnam is an event unique within American history. There will never be cause or recourse to invoke the draft over something which, in hindsight, was so ephemeral to American interest as preventing the expansion of communism in French Indochina. But there you have it, especially if you take my, rather revisionist angle to America precipitating that conflict with getting rid of No Din Siem. But there we are. The whole Nixon angle and the Apocalypse Now angle reinforce each other in the sense that under Gerald Ford and under Jimmy Carter, we see a conscious attempt to rehabilitate the quote-unquote draft dodgers, to exonerate them and offer them mass pardons. And that, in its sense, again, like with the film Apocalypse Now, is basically a testament to the fact that the US government under Nixon was illegitimate in pursuing this war, and that we are actually truer to the spirit of America and its rights-based democracy by acknowledging that the people who avoided the draft, who in an earlier era were called traitors, had demonstrable grievances which were legitimate. And that in itself was the death knell for the cause of the Vietnam War. And what better to have a great moment of relief, of sort of spiritual sort of exorcism, than a moment like the film Apocalypse Now. Again, in terms of the roles, the sort of meta roles that films serve, and how you can almost look at Apocalypse Now and say that in the intention of taking Joseph Conrad, taking the moment of the Heart of Darkness and trying to extrapolate it and place it on to Vietnam, again, it was all part of an intention there. This is completely sort of, by the way, accepting the Baudrillardian premises when I'm using these arguments. And all of this is, again, to prove a point that people see this in terms of the role that historical films serve. So in the case of Yut Sus with Viet Halen, the idea again is that it's supposed to nudge people into accepting basically the historical examples which necessitate a view towards anti-Semitism. In Kohlberg, the example is that Germany has undergone a moment of national paralysis and suffocation as a result of the French during the Napoleonic Wars. And yet we have this one example right at the moment where the Russians are crossing over the Oder River in 1945, where we can win the war by invoking that triumphant spirit of 1813, when we end at Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, and Napoleon is overthrown, which would have again been an inversion of what we saw with World War II. In terms of films in America extending this to the military-industrial complex, you can extend it to films like Top Gun, obviously. That's almost like a rote example, that Top Gun was used by the Navy and the US Air Force basically to project a end of Cold War sort of sense of glamour and prestige attached to the role of the pilot in a way, again, which bolstered that organization right at a time, again, where the unipolar moment was coming, where Gorbachev was inaugurating perestroika, and that the enemy was becoming increasingly nebulous. So again, more sort of you can read into this, the more sort of fascinating arguments you can sort of run away with. And this comes to my sort of final point regarding technology, which is something which I have to comment on given the fact that this was written in the 1980s. I've been using examples, of course, all over the place and very recent examples, but I have to point to the example of AI. How does AI figure into this? It's something I'm loath to talk about, but feel compelled to do so. If we are basically going to look at cinema as history expressed as a triumph of technology and nothing more, and how Baudrillard sees it, extending the parameters for possible reenactment, but most importantly for Baudrillard, not only having an exceptional quality of reenactment, but being able to proliferate in a way which has mass appeal and a homogenizing effect, which was previously impossible. In the case of AI, you could almost say that there's a possibility for the inverse effect, that people will use AI in order to create simulations of historical events without reference to the need of the homogenizing center, without consolidating all the resources of cultural manufacture in Hollywood or other political camps or centers of filmmaking throughout the world, and thereby AI, ostensibly from this point of view, can actually represent a process of film as historical reenactment, which is also, again, given over to the local mythologies. You can sort of broaden the means in which we can basically express film and topic in a way that confound the notions of budget and scale, which we had previously. Yet at the same time, you can say, okay, well, what's the validity in that? What's the purpose of that? We've reached the point where technology can rival that of the major films, and it can be democratized in a way to actually prove Baudrillard wrong, to subvert them. But the argument would then follow, what is the point of this? What is the point in creating a hyperreal imitation of whatever it is, again, the individual wants to create through AI? And it comes back to this point of view, is this real history? Is this nostalgia? Is this political advocacy? Is this some sort of self-referential, sort of self-affirming myth? What is it? And it comes back to the process that history is fundamentally analytical. It's a process of interrogation. And so whatever is created out of that system would, again, in order to represent history, as opposed to what Baudrillard is essentially referring to as this passive, inactive reception based on whatever, again, psychological faults or fetishization, again, using his words, you will have to, again, try and raise the attempted AI and the emphasis on hyperreal to a level which I haven't really seen used. And that is unfortunate. And when I'm speaking about this, I'm also, it should be mentioned, putting aside my own prejudices here, which are tending towards being a Luddite when it comes to AI. I'm simply referring to this as I'm taking myself out of that analysis in order to basically present, okay, how does AI feature into the process of technology, filmmaking, decentralization, and the simulacra? It raises possibilities, but it also, again, refers back to the premise of intention. What is it all for? What is the purpose in AI aspiring to hyperreal recreations, again, of the human form? What is this, again, supposed to signify? Is this a liberation from the simulacra, or is it a mass intensification of which, again, we have never been been subject to before? So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is to look at Barry Lyndon and the other examples that Baudrillard used and say, okay, well, what is this again? Is this history which is being embalmed? That's one way of looking at it. In Simulation and Simulacra, he brings up, Baudrillard, the example of Ramesses and the fact that we have the idea of the divine pharaoh, and then we have the fetishization of the mummified corpse, and what that says to us about says of us as a society in terms of our emphasis on the fetishization of the mummy as a historical relic. Why is that significant or superior in any way to looking at this as a divine object, which shouldn't be presented and paraded around as the mummy of Ramesses II is? That is a genuine question. And this comes back to the idea of, okay, is the fetish, for lack of a better word, on hyperrealism within historical enactment to recreate this moment that'll last forever, is it, again, worthy of this sort of iconoclasm where it's appealing to an idea of God? History is elevated to such an extent that it almost necessitates a iconoclastic response, in which case we have the embalmment. It's not just sort of the case we have the embalmment of Pharaoh, but ironically the embalmment of Lenin was truer to the principles of the original embalmment of Pharaoh, in the sense that you were trying to create gods out of socialism, or at least saints out of socialism. And so by extension, embalming Lenin, is that also a process that refers back to the making of films? Is the embalmed corpse of Lenin true history, or were the events and the revolutionary events which we associate with, or are we dispossessed from them forever? It's I'm sort of rambling in terms of all the implications, but the point is you can draw any number of these conclusions. So it comes to the idea of historical distortionism, which is something that Baudrillard doesn't really refer to, and I can really understand why, because his focus instead has been on hyperreality. In terms of modern historical distortionism, this is where history really breaks down in terms of its ability to represent that perfect simulacra, that semblance of reality, in the sense that these break the limits of human credulity. There are examples which are more successfully done, such as that film, which I think everyone has forgotten now, Hidden Figures, which was a extremely sort of revisionist fantasy history about uh, America getting into space, revolving around the exploit of three black women. That you can say is historical distortionism, which does buy into the notions of the Baudrillardian simulacra. It had a lot of political patronage from the Democratic Party and the Obamas in particular, and then it becomes part of the school system in America, as far as I've been told. Indeed, many films relating to the American civil rights movement have, you can say, achieved this semi-divine or sacramental status in order to propagate memory and myth. I was going to think of various examples in which to compound the Vietnam analogy. One is Full Metal Jacket in terms of bringing back Stanley Kubrick. But I was actually thinking of another example, which is We Were Soldiers, starring Mel Gibson, which is that even though it's primarily a Vietnam War, which attempted to dispel much of the mythology around Vietnam, instead, there is a scene in it which basically hits the audience on the head regarding the role of segregation in the 1960s, even though by the beginning of the Vietnam War, we're talking the end of the Civil Rights Act effectively. This is effectively sort of passing into sort of history in the purest sense there. But nevertheless, there are moments basically of this reference towards history where you can say this hyper focus, or in the cases of something like Hidden Figures, this distortionism is emphasized in a way in order to propagate a popular myth. And this, I think, also creates a level of historical disdain from academic historians, in the sense that popular memory is something we can tweak. It's something which is passively imbibed, and as long as they can inculcate positive political messages, then these things should be promoted. Only historians should focus on real history. And I always come back to Alexander Pope when talking about something like obscurantism, which is there is an argument that could be made for it. Deep drink of the Pyrean spring, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And I think a little knowledge in terms of providing people history, but in a rather balked and perverted way, is incredibly damaging. Part of the reason the way that history is taught in schools, I think, is actually helps less than it does. It's less helpful than perhaps it should be compared to other languages and mathematics, geometry, and other subjects that you can basically teach at school. I believe history is almost in a unique position where it almost can't be taught at school. It's too complicated. We have to sort of go back to sort of learning these dates by rote. So continuing on, again, a more modern example would be Cleopatra. And in that case, again, the simulacra completely breaks down, and it becomes a moment of revilement and sort of universal mockery. So, what force is animating that response against something like Cleopatra? Is it again this notion that history is in fact alive, that we still expect Cleopatra to conform to a notion of the reality existing beyond the simulation? Or is it again this pseudo-fascistic desire that we have an idea of the past that by necessity we need to project onto the future? And Cleopatra basically obfuscates that. It provides an obstacle for which we need to essentially overcome. You can sort of use these examples, ad nauseum, ad infinitum, but that's sort of as far as I'm willing to sort of go in terms of dealing with the context of historical distortionism. Needless to say, I sort of retreat back to my old position, which is that if we're going to look at film as useful, as historical artifacts, then they should, again, invite people into a sense of the spirit of truth, an aspect of verisimilitude. They should also be very engaging. And I also don't sort of hold up the idea that they should be flawless or literal reenactments. I think, in the sort of Lynchian sense, a way that a film can engage over and over again in many different ways, like something which is apparently stilted, artificial, and mechanical, cold, dead, like Barry Lyndon. It has the capacity to engage me, at least. I believe it has the capacity to engage thousands of people. Yes, you can go back to this idea of the conformist nature of creating an image of the past through film, which basically eliminates, destroys all other images of the past. Yet the counter argument is if you have such an image, then it'll naturally invite people into a moment of the past in order that they can iterate on that understanding. They can form their own histories based on a moment of inspiration. That is essentially where I'm going to leave the conversation, but Baudrillard is fascinating, yet at the same time, I am not as cynical in terms of accepting his argumentation. I don't believe all of these things are fake. I believe that the 1945 moment is unique in terms of its unrelenting nature and its all-encompassing, totalizing effect, but I don't believe it's as unique as he's making out to be. I believe the arguments you can make regarding cinema can be made to historical facts and fetishism of things sort of writ large, going back thousands of years, not just hundreds of years. And indeed, in fairness to Baudrillard, he does accept this, and he rightly links all of this argument back to the iconoclastic controversy in the 9th century. This is all about the discarded image, the sacred image. I think, if you're going to have a more right-leaning interpretation of Baudrillard, you can say that part of the impetus between trying to create simulacra and simulation is, to sort of use the psychologizing language back to him, it is a nostalgia for the discarded image. You can sort of read this extending on from C.S. Lewis. The medievals had a conception of a totalizing sort of cosmology, a way of looking at the world where everything referenced everything else. Representation was uniquely manifested in a full sort of coalescing, and that has been lost. Instead, essentially what we have is, from his point of view, simulacra in its place. And if that is the case, again, truly, then if there are historical films that slip through, that can invite people into a authentic, again, lack of a better word, representation of the past, then so long as you don't fetishize the event, you're not basically attempting to immortalize some historical moment or use it as some, again, great moment of moral or sort of political sort of sanctification of an event, then I don't really see much of an issue. Anyway, we'll get to the super chats, and if people have a question in the chat, please ask me now while I get through the super chats. Otherwise, I will go, but thank you. Strictly AM for $7 Canadian. Thank you very much. Doesn't say anything. Strictly AM, if you are still in the chat, do tell me, and I'll try to respond to a question. Ambivalent Teacher for $7 Canadian. Thank you very much. Can't watch live, but will watch when I have free time. Thank you for all the excellent content recently, and thank you very much, Ambivalent Teacher. You've been a very generous super chatter as of yet. Cat Wizard TM for $5. Thank you very much. Adjacent to this topic, are video games art? Is a video game capable of presenting historical themes through world building, Deliverance, Witcher 3? Well, as you know, Cat Wizard TM, I've done 2 game reviews on this channel. I've talked about Bethesda games and Obsidian games. I've talked about Morrowind, and I've talked about Fallout New Vegas. Fallout New Vegas, I think, relates back to this in the sense that I do talk about historical authenticity, and I talk about Vegas, its culture. And part of the impetus behind that game essentially was actually playing into the meta around the foundation of Vegas itself. Little nods and jokes like the fact that Caesar's Legion is an extension of Caesar's Palace, the hotel, but it's not just a gag, which would perhaps appear in other cultural iterations. It is a serious investigation on post-apocalyptic tribal warfare and new forms of government. Yet it's also an allusion to things like cowboys and Indians and Mad Max. The fact you can read so much into, and that's just again the top of my head, the fact you can read so much into Fallout New Vegas again is just a testament to the fact that, of course, it's art. Um, as for Witcher 3 and as for the Witcher series in general, not the television series, I wouldn't count that. But yes, I think especially in terms of exhibiting sort of aspects of Eastern European, Central European, Polish culture. Um, no, I don't see why not. I haven't played Deliverance. But yes, games, in terms of the sense that games don't present a strict narrative, the fact that, especially in open world games, you can explore and to some extent you can affect the world around you. I think in many ways it's, on the one hand, you can say it's an intensification of the simulation. You are buying into this fantasy world and you are using it in lieu of an objective reality. That's one way of looking at it. Yet at the same time, it's actually allowing you to engage with the material in a way where you're not simply the passive receptacle, in a way that you can denigrate some film watchers. So yes, I think I'm also quite liberal when it comes to looking at games as a form of artistic expression. Yes, has anyone actually asked me a question? We're talking about sedevacantists and the SSPX and liberation theology. But this is a question. Is cinema a stand-in for the Eucharist in this sense? Well, the Eucharist is an act of participation. You know what? We are participating in a event of hierophany. You know, the revelation of the divine. We are recreating. It's more than a recreation. We are involved in the Last Supper. You know, that's the purpose of the Eucharist. If you hold up a film, you know, in the same way a lot of people did this about Wagner, which is why I brought up the example between Apocalypse Now, Wagner, and Nietzsche, and why Baudrillard brings up that comparison. If you sincerely look at Siegfried and the Ring of the Nibelungen and say this is a new mass for Germany, Wagner doesn't require watchers, he requires converts, then yes, you can say that media, in a sense, does perform a Eucharistic rite. You know, the whole congregation imbibing the lessons essentially which has been told. Um, Again, it sort of depends on your emphasis as opposed to whether Eucharist is signification or its transubstantiation. You can look in gradations of this, but yes, I think there is an angle in which you can judge cinema as being Eucharistic, and I think this plays into the old adage of the iconoclast and the iconojewel controversy. Have you ever thought of doing a video essay on decline of Great American Society 1960s onwards? No, because there are plenty of Americans who I'm familiar with and collaborate with who are far more experienced and far more informed about this topic than I. And so in the case of American history, I tend to defer. I have one idea of an American history stream that I've been wanting to do, but I had my opportunity a month ago when it was the 250th anniversary of America's founding, but I didn't get around to it, so I think I've lost my opportunity. Right. When it comes to sort of regarding questions of AI, I mean, I have nothing really but negative things to say about AI. You know, you can dream of a world, or you can speculate, as I have, about expecting that AI could theoretically afford the opportunity for auteurism and a decentralization of the methods of making convincing film. Yet I don't think that's how AI as a trajectory is going to go, unfortunately. Right. Thank you very much for listening, and good night. And thank you to everyone who sent a super chat. It's very much appreciated.